Since the dawn of time, we've been fooled into thinking that the Special Cup poses the biggest challenge when it comes to racing in Mario Kart. I mean, how could it not, when it contains some of the most infamous tracks in the franchise's history? But that's just it. See, Rainbow Road is nothing more than a clever guise used to hide the true horrors of one particular cup. A cup so outrageously heinous that most people won't even utter its name. And no, it's not the Flower Cup. Although the number of Mario circuits present in those cups is extremely concerning. No, the cup I am referring to is the elusive Star Cup, and the question on my mind is which Mario Kart has the hardest Star Cup. To test this, I raced through each cup 50 times while noting down my placements for each of them. I then took the average of every single Grand Prix to get an average placement for that specific cup. We'll then compare this number across every Mario Kart until we get a final ranking from easiest to hardest. For consistency's sake, every race was done at 150cc using Mario in the standard kart for that game. With that out of the way, let's travel down memory lane to where it all began. Now, while I chose to race through each of these cups 50 times as a way to gather a large sample size, the other reason had to do with games like Super Mario Kart. See, no matter how many times I come back to this game, I'm always complete dogshit.
Oh brother, this guy stinks!
That being said, I'm hoping that after 50 races, I'll have become somewhat decent, and the results will therefore be more reflective of the cup's overall difficulty rather than my mediocre driving skills. Anyway, the cup starts off with Cooper Beach 1, which in my opinion is the easiest track in the whole cup. The layout is fairly basic and the roads are extremely wide to the point where it's almost impossible to go off-road. There are hardly any obstacles, and while the CPUs are blatant cheaters, actual bullshit, it didn't stop me securing first place most of the time. This trend continued into the next track, Choco Island 2. The roads here are a fair bit tighter than in Cooper Beach, but again there aren't too many obstacles that can screw you over, so really it just comes down to your driving ability. Super Mario Kart is a fairly slippery game though, so I did find myself off-road more frequently than in Cooper Beach, which led to a lower average placement. Overall though, I wouldn't consider this a challenging track either, especially when compared to this next one. Shit. Oh my fuck's sake. Sweet. Oh, Vanilla Lake. I fucking hate this track. This is by far one of the hardest tracks in the entire cup. No, scratch that. It's one of the hardest tracks in the entire video. As you just heard me say, Super Mario Kart is a slippery game. So whose bright idea was it to then have us race on top of ice of all things? What's that? 2 negatives make a positive? Yeah, right. This shit is grim, and I found myself sliding all over the place as I struggled to drift around the track. Not only that, but the track is full of little barricades that you can hardly see. Thankfully they do melt after being hit, but this means fuck all because you're the only one that's going to be hitting them in the first place. See, the CPUs never seem to have a problem weaving through them. I mean, why am I even surprised when they can do things like this? Bro, this shit is fucking ass. Vanilla Lake 1 requires extremely precise driving, and if you screw up, it's almost impossible to catch up. Now, if you thought Vanilla Lake was the hardest track in the cup, let me introduce you to Bowser's Castle 3, the track that single-handedly made me reconsider if I really wanted to race through each of these cups 50 times. Dude, how am I so shit? This track has all the telltales of a difficult track. The roads are extremely narrow and the turns are especially sharp. The roads are also surrounded by walls that stop your momentum immediately if you hit them, but only sometimes. Why does this shit only happen on this track? The obstacles are extremely annoying, like these swamps that block off your path completely. And you know what the worst part is? The CPUs can just jump over them. Like, hello?
This is fucking bullshit.
I honestly can't tell you how many times I got screwed over while racing this track. It was truly one of the worst experiences I've had this year. Thankfully, the final track of this cup was a complete cakewalk. I was honestly surprised at just how simple Mario Circuit 4 was. The roads are fairly wide and the turns aren't particularly hard to drift around. There are a few obstacles in the form of these pipes, but apart from that, there isn't too much to say about it. Now, to no one's surprise I'm sure, Bowser's Castle 3 proved to be the hardest track with an average placement of 1.94. In terms of overall placements, Super Mario Kart Star Cup proved to be fairly challenging with an average placement of 1.5. With nothing to compare this number to, I think it's high time we zoomed on over to the franchise's first 3D experience. God, even though I revisit this game on a frequent basis, I still can't help but feel a wave of nostalgia after that title screen. Now, much like Super Mario Kart, Mario Kart 64 Star Cup opens up with a somewhat rudimentary track. Wario Stadium has extremely wide roads and at no point can you fall off it. It's got some little speed bumps throughout the course, but these hardly do anything at all. I'm actually at a loss for what to say about this track, and I think that goes to show just how simple and basic this track is. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for this next track. Much like Vanilla Lake, the slippery physics that come with ice maps is present here. And not only that, but this one has penguins that dash from side to side or walk around these pillars. They aren't particularly hard to avoid, but you can never be sure when racing on top of ice. I will say that the openness of this track makes for a more forgiving experience when compared to its predecessor. Royal Raceway takes the 3rd slot in this Star Cup, and again it's a relatively simple track. The layout isn't anything to worry about, and while the roads themselves are fairly narrow, the turns are spread out and wide in nature. The only tricky part are the winding turns towards the end of the lap, and these can be pretty brutal if you don't nail your turning angles. The fact that they are placed at the end of the lap can also lead to some pretty heartbreaking moments. The cup ends with Bowser's Castle, the hardest track in the entire cup. Now, I say the hardest track, but this one doesn't come anywhere close to its predecessor's iteration of the same track. Now, with that being said, it's most definitely the hardest track in this particular Star Cup, and that's mainly due to these two thwomps. These assholes will do anything in their power to make avoiding them absolutely miserable. Some of the turns at the end could also be fairly sharp as well, but honestly, I think fatigue is what screwed me the most when driving through this track again and again and again. Overall, Mario Kart 64 Star Cup wasn't as difficult as its predecessors. As expected, Bowser's Castle once again took the spot as the hardest track with an average placement of 1.62. My average placement across the 50 cup races was 1.36, which places it behind Super Mario Kart in terms of difficulty. Now we've arrived at the most underrated Mario Kart game, Super Circuit, or as I like to call it, Super Mario Kart, because let's be real, it's essentially just a more slippery version of Super Mario Kart, if you can believe that. Now I'll be the first one to say that I was complete dogshit at this game at one point. And while my skills haven't improved tremendously,
Oh, look at the class, look at the moves!
I think I can hold my own, or at least I thought I could, until I came face to face with Snowland. I'm not even sure what it was about this track, but my first few attempts were absolutely tragic. I slid all over the place, I fell into the icy water countless times, and I even boosted across a few galaxies only to slam straight into a wall. Thankfully, after a few attempts, I started to get the hang of this track, but man, was it tough to control my drift angles on this bloody ice. Thankfully, the cup opens up into an easier track with Ribbon Road. There isn't too much to say about this one. The roads are relatively wide, and while there are a few windy turns towards the end of the track, they aren't anything to write home about. Overall, a relatively easy track, which isn't something I thought I'd say about this game. Yoshi Desert was up next, and like Ribbon Road, I don't have too much to say about it. The layout of the track is fairly basic, and the lack of obstacles makes for a relatively calm driving experience. There were a few hiccups experienced during my races, but then again, it's Mario Kart, so of course those were bound to happen at some point. I can't say any of them had to do with the difficulty of the track itself though. Ah shit. I guess Bowser's Castle is the Rainbow Road of the Star Cup. And trust me when I say that I'm not just talking about its consistency. This track reminds me so much of Super Mario Kart's iteration. The roads are narrow, there are plenty of areas to fall off into the lava, and the turns are just a nightmare to drift around. Honestly, I think this iteration may be even harder than the originals. I can't even begin to describe the number of instances where I just got absolutely obliterated. Oh no shot, how am I coming off worse there? It was by far the worst experience I had faced up till now. I know it, you know it. Bowser's Castle once again took the spot as the hardest track in this Star Cup with an average placement of 1.96. With this, Bowser's Castle has scored a hat-trick, much like Rainbow Road did for the Special Cup. My overall average placement came out to be 1.52, making it the most difficult Star Cup so far. I wonder if Double Dash can get us out of this never-ending cycle. Well, from the looks of it, I don't think it will. As is customary of every Star Cup it seems, Double Dash begins with an icy track in Sherbet Land, and just like any other ice-based track, I found myself sliding all over the place. The overall layout of this track isn't anything difficult, but the obstacles present can cause quite a disturbance as they're placed on top of the icy terrain, making them far more difficult to avoid completely. It's probably one of the harder tracks in this particular Star Cup. Now while it may be one of the harder tracks, it's definitely not the hardest, as that title belongs to this next track, Mushroom City. Mushroom City is essentially every major city during peak hour. There's this constant stream of cars and buses and, whatever the fuck this thing's supposed to be. The roads themselves are wide in nature, but they're so crowded with vehicles that it requires extremely precise driving to slip past them, especially when there's like these two cars taking up the whole lane. I mean, what the fuck is this? Definitely one of the more brutal tracks in this Star Cup. From here, the cup kind of tapers off in terms of difficulty, as we zoom on over to Yoshi's Circuit. This one's just like any other circuit track, and while the layout pays homage to our lovable dinosaur, it doesn't exactly scream challenging. The piranha plants are pretty much cosmetic, and while there are some windy turns, they aren't frequent nor sharp enough to cause any real problems. The cup finishes with DK Mountain, which I'd also consider a relatively easy track. Half the track is just a straight shot through a cannon, and the rest is a race down a windy mountain. Now I say windy, but in reality it's just driving down a massive road while avoiding these slow ass moving boulders. There are a few tighter turns towards the end that are marked by these large gaps, but once you get the drifting of Double Dash down, these are relatively easy to drift around. Double Dash proved to be a mixed bag when it came to challenging tracks. Mushroom City took the spot as the most difficult track in this cup with an average placement of 1.73. This paired with the rest of the tracks led to an average placement of 1.46 across all 50 attempts, putting it somewhere in the middle of the pack for now. It's time to open up my personal favorite, Mario Kart. Now funnily enough, we go from DK Mountain to DK Pass on Mario Kart DS. Now DK Mountain was already an easy track, but DK Pass takes this to another level. There's only one somewhat hard section in this entire track, and it's right at the beginning with these winding turns. Even if you do screw these up somehow, you've got plenty of time to race down the rest of the pass, which contains nothing but wide roads and long straights. The turns are extremely simple to drift around, and the boulders are a complete joke to avoid. If you're still somehow not convinced that this is one of the easiest tracks ever, there was one particular race where I got hit by 3 separate blue shells, once on each lap, and I still fucking won. Like what? Next up was Tick Tock Clock, a relatively complex track in comparison to most of the tracks in this cup. I tend to think of this track as the track of obstacles due to the copious amounts of clock hands and pendulums that stand in your way. Now despite me saying that, the roads themselves give you so much breathing room that avoiding these obstacles isn't challenging at all. The sharpest turns are towards the end of the track, but even then they aren't particularly hard to maneuver around, making for another easy track. Here's hoping the next track brings us some challenge. Oh, come on! What else is there to say about this track? I mean, it's your standard Mario circuit. The track layout is extremely plain, and while there are piranha plants that shoot fireballs, I honestly found it harder to get hit by them than avoid them altogether. Now as you'd expect, the cup finishes with what I'd consider to be the hardest track, but honestly, with what we've covered so far, that isn't really saying much. Airship Fortress starts off with us avoiding these massive bullet bills, and I just can't help but wonder, but has anyone ever been hit by one of these? I mean, they're just too slow to cause any real problems. These Monty Moles, on the other hand, can cause quite a few problems. See, not only are their jumping patterns hard to predict, but they're also placed in the section with the sharpest turns, making for a rather nasty area of the track. The only other hurdle is this long winding road down the tower at the end. If you don't come into it with the right drift angle, there's a good chance you'll bounce off the wall, which can kill all of your momentum. Now as you'd expect, Airship Fortress came out on top as the hardest track in DS's Star Cup. As I was saying though, this isn't exactly a hard title to obtain considering my average placement on it was 1.21. This Star Cup was by far the easiest one so far, as my overall average placement across all 50 races was a measly 1.1. Honestly, I'm curious to see if anything could beat this as the easiest Star Cup, and I'll tell you what, it definitely wasn't going to be this next game. Mario Kart Wii's Star Cup starts off with Daisy Circuit, which to this day remains one of my favorite tracks. And no, it has nothing to do with its difficulty. In fact, Daisy Circuit is probably the easiest track in the entire cup. Sure, it's got this calming and divine aesthetic, but in reality it's just another basic circuit track that has simple turns and long straights. I think its theme is one of the best in the game though, and I'm willing to die on that rock. I might have to take that back actually, because next up is Koopa Cape, which has an even more impressive theme. Not only does it have the better theme in my opinion, but it's also a more challenging track, mainly because of its tighter turns and higher octane speeds while in deep water. It's definitely not a hard track in the grand scheme of things, but so far it definitely takes the cake for the toughest track in this cup. And it looks like it's about to lose that cake, as the next track is Maple Treeway. God, I didn't realize how many bangers Wii Star Cup had. Maple Treeway continues the trend of each track being slightly harder than the last.
It's got a few sections that require precise turns, otherwise you'll end up plummeting to your death.
The massive wigglers at times can block your path, and while it's not a common occurrence, there are times where you have to accept being
Oh,
clapped.
this better not fuck me. Alright. Oh, blue shell as well, huh? What, am I not gonna make it over now? Oh, for fuck's sake, dude.
But if you thought that was brutal, wait until you see the horrors of this last track. Now, I've always said that Grumble Volcano is probably the hardest track in Mario Kart Wii. Sure, you could argue Rainbow Road is, but there's just something about Grumble Volcano that always humbles me when I come back to this game.
Oh, unreal.
Is it the ever-changing layout of the track? The copious amounts of obstacles that blitz you mid-air? Maybe? It's the combination of the two, while also trying to avoid all the other races and their items. This track will always be a nightmare to me, and it was by far the most difficult experience I had on Mario Kart Wii's Star Cup. At the end of this game's Star Cup, Grumble Volcano had taken the slot as the hardest track by quite a significant margin. This in turn caused my overall average to be a fair bit higher than I had predicted at 1.42. This places it somewhere in the middle of the pack, and while this was well within my expectations, I never would have guessed where this next game would place. Mario Kart 7, the one that everyone seems to forget about, despite the fact that half of Mario Kart 8's mechanics stem from it. Well, maybe not half. What is present in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is Piranha Plant Slide, which also happens to be the first track in this game's Star Cup. Now, Piranha Plant Slide is a fairly compact course, meaning there's a lot of tight turn angles that are oftentimes filled with annoying piranha plants that look to cut you off. And boy, do they cut you off.
Bro, what? He has like a billion range.
The final set of winding turns may also require some brake drifting if you've come into them at the wrong angle. Now, I both love and hate Wario Shipyard. Its theming and layout is extremely unique, and it's because of this that it's also one of the hardest tracks in the entire cup. If the copious amounts of obstacles weren't bad enough, this track also has some of the sharpest turns in the entire game. It's a shame this track remains a Mario Kart 7 exclusive, as I think it has a lot of potential. But then again, I imagine that's part of the reason why I find this track more challenging than other tracks that have been reused. And speaking of reused tracks, here's a track that has haunted my dreams in the past.
Shit, fuck me.
Now thankfully, on 150cc, Neo Bowser City isn't nearly as bad as those horrid moments in Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. That being said, it does still have the notorious set of sharp turns with no barriers to save you. Even so, the slower output of 150cc makes it much more manageable this time around, and the rest of the track isn't too bad either. The cup finishes off with Maka Woohoo, which is another multi-section track. The fact that each lap is completely different from the previous one does help spice things up and keeps you on your toes throughout the whole race. Section 2 is without a doubt the toughest part of the entire track as you enter this cave area. I'm too tired to be dealing with this shit. Outside of that though, this track has a lot of long straights which can be a pro or a con. See, if you're already in the lead coming into these straights, it's rather simple to keep it. If you do fall behind before coming into these sections though, it's extremely hard to catch up, and there were countless instances where I felt hopeless as I slowly glided down into second or third place. At the end of Mario Kart 7's Star Cup, Wario Shipyard came out as the hardest track with an average placement of 1.65. And here's the real shock. My overall average for this Star Cup came out at 1.48, placing it just behind both Super Mario Kart and Super Circuit Star Cups. Now, if you told me to rank these games before doing this video, I definitely wouldn't have placed Mario Kart 7 Star Cup this high up. It truly was the dark horse of this entire experiment. And with that, we've arrived at our final game, the ancient Mario Kart 8, or in this case, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. This game's Star Cup starts off with Sunshine Airport, and let me tell you, if airport customs were as smooth and easy as this track was, the world would be a better place. To this day, I still believe this track was made with planes in mind. I mean, look at how wide these roads are. It's almost impossible to go off-road when the whole map is pretty much the road. In fact, my races on this track were so rudimentary that I didn't even notice a concerning problem, but we'll get into that soon. Next up was Dolphin Shoals, a track that has one of the best themes in Mario Kart history. But the question is, does the track go as hard as its music? No, it doesn't. It's definitely more challenging than Sunshine Airport, and that's mainly due to this multi-path section in the middle. It's not really that bad on 150cc, but I do remember it posing quite a challenge on 200cc. Electrodome. This one was the dark horse of this entire cup. and it was definitely more difficult than I originally thought. See, while the track itself isn't overly complex, nor does it have many obstacles, the fact that the roads themselves are compact during certain sections makes things a lot more chaotic in general. I can't count the number of times I got railed on this track, and it mainly came down to the fact that everyone was so packed in together that it made it impossible to avoid situations like this.
Oh my god, what the fuck is that? What the fuck is what? What are you looking at? What did you see? What are you doing?
God, I get goosebumps watching this back, and this was far more common on this track than any other. It was also around this point that I noticed something was up with my controller. Mario didn't seem to be controlling exactly how I wanted him to, so I went into time trials to test if something was wrong, and almost immediately I could tell that my Pro controller had fallen victim to Joy-Con drift. Look, if we compare this race here to my wide controller, you can see that Mario is supposed to drive in a completely straight line across the lane markings. And you're probably thinking, oh come on, that's not even that bad for Joy-Con drift. Well, what if I showed you this clip instead? Now, I'm not sure about you guys, but this shit is just unplayable. The other two tracks were just so easy that I hadn't even noticed it until I got my ass blasted in Electrodome. And before anyone starts saying that I'm coping hard because I just got railed in that race, like guys, come on, I swear I'm actually pretty good at these games. Like it was the controller's fault. Like I'm good at Mario. Anyway, with the new controller in play, let's move on to the final track in this cup, Mount Wario. Now if DK Mountain or DK Pass has taught us anything, it's that any track that has you racing down a mountain is extraordinarily easy. And I have to say, this theory still holds true with this track. Now I will give Mount Wario some credit, mainly due to the second section of the track, as there are quite a few trees that get in the way here and are fairly tough to avoid each and every time. The rest of the track however has ultra wide turns or long straights that you just saw down while gliding. The only thing that could screw you up on this track is boredom, and trust me, if you were to race through each of these cups 50 times in a row, you'd probably start to get bored, but only dumbasses would do that, like what? Now taking all of that into account, the hardest track in Mario Kart 8 Star Cup was Electrodome with an average placement of 1.25. The cup in general was one of the easiest to complete with an average placement of 1.14. With all that said and done, I think it's about time we ranked these Star Cups from easiest to hardest. Mario Kart DS leads the charge by having the easiest Star Cup out of the whole bunch with an average placement of 1.1. These placements can be attributed to many of the tracks present in this Star Cup having fairly simple designs and a lack of obstacles. DS was then followed by Mario Kart 8 and Mario Kart 64 Star Cups with an average placement of 1.14 and 1.36 respectively. Now the rest of these games' Star Cups were relatively close when it came to average placements, and on any other day, the results could have been completely different. Either way, for this video, Super Circuit proved to have the hardest Star Cup with an average placement of 1.52. This can pretty much be attributed all to Bowser's Castle 3, which I still believe is one of the hardest tracks in the entire franchise. I would go on and on about it, but the more I think about it, the deeper I fall into depression, so I'll just leave it at that. This is how each of these Star Cups stacks up against one another. Do let me know if you guys agree or disagree with these rankings. I mean, I'm not sure how you're going to disagree when I've gone through all the effort of racing through each of these things like a billion times, but maybe you're just naturally a God-gifted Super Circuit master. I mean, hey, if you are, shoot me a DM, please. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I do wish you a great rest of your day. I'll catch you all in the next one.